Hello BookTube. I've got a history book for you today. This is Assyria, The Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire by Eckart Frahm. So if you've watched this channel before, you'll know that I'm a history buff, but in the past I've approached my study of history randomly, jumping all over the place. Now that I'm back in the United States, the idea has struck me that I'd like to try and work through history systematically. So start all the way back at the beginning and then work my way forward in time. I'm not sure I'm going to stick with it, but I'm going to at least give it a try. And Assyria is maybe not the very beginning, but it's pretty close to the beginning. And I saw this one in my local bookstore. This is actually not a library book this time. I saw it in the bookstore and I decided to splurge on it. Treat yourself every once in a while, right? So it's a fairly new book, which is why it was being sold in the bookstore. And it's also a popular history. You can see the title here has a little blurb from the Wall Street Journal, which says, sweeping, delightfully readable. And yeah, it is very readable. Now, I really like narrative histories, history books that tell history like a story. And this is perhaps as close as you can get to that for the subject of Assyria. The problem with the study of Assyria is there's just so many gaps in our knowledge that it's difficult to tell a complete story. There are certain areas where we know some things and certain areas where we don't know some things. But the author of this book has put it together in a readable count. He has used narrative history where he can, where we know enough, where he can tell a story. And where we can't, he still produces a very readable account. So if you're like me, your main introduction to Assyria is from the Bible. And like many people, I guess, my knowledge of world history from the Bible has been the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. So I thought Assyria would be a good place to start. What was interesting reading this book, though, one of the many things I learned from this book is that Babylon was actually the older civilization. I guess there had been like a Babylonian civilization before there was an Assyrian empire. And then when Babylon became resurgent and conquered Assyria, that was actually Babylon kind of coming back into dominance. So there had been Babylon, and then there was Assyria, and then there was Babylon again. Although the author makes the case that Assyria was actually the world's first empire. So I guess Babylon was an ancient civilization, but not empire before Assyria. But by the way, as the author acknowledges in this book, there is some controversy about whether or not Assyria is the world's first empire, and it depends a little bit on your definition of empire. Some people think that there had been empires which predated Assyria, like Sargon of Akkad, etc. Other people think that Assyria was not properly an empire and that you don't truly get an empire until like the Greeks or the Romans or something. So the author acknowledges that controversy in this book, but he does make the case that in his estimation, Assyria, by any reasonable definition, was the world's first empire. So yeah, if you're interested in more of that controversy, you can read it in the pages of this book. But anyways, yeah, Assyria and Babylon. One of the interesting things in here was how much of Babylonian culture Assyria borrowed, and how much Assyria always had kind of an inferiority complex between its own culture, which it knew was a new culture, and the Babylonian culture, which was viewed as more ancient and more respectable. The author compares it to Greece and Rome, or Britain and the United States, where there was a new power on the scene, but they had kind of taken all their culture from a previous power. So that was interesting. I didn't know that. And the interplay between Assyria and Babylonia, or Babylon, throughout this history was one of the many fascinating things about this book. And I'd really be interested in picking up a history of Babylon next. And stay tuned to this channel, because you just might see me review a history of Babylon in the near future. And by near future, I mean the next few months. But I'll get around to it sooner or later. That was interesting. Also, on this channel, I've reviewed some books from Babylonian literature. The Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Code of Hammurabi, all Babylonian texts, which it turns out were all three influential in the Assyrian Empire as well. So that was kind of cool, because when you read these texts, you're kind of thinking, okay, well, these are some old documents we have, but how influential were they really in the ancient world? And it was interesting that all three of those texts get mentioned repeatedly in this book as texts that were influential not only in Babylon, but also in Assyria. So just interesting to think about the history of these texts. And it made me think that maybe I ought to come back and give a reread to the Epic of Gilgamesh one of these days. And maybe I will. Stay tuned on this channel. Maybe I'll revisit that. Excuse me. Got a little bit of a dry throat, so I might be drinking tea throughout this. So that was one of the many interesting things. The book traces the history of Assyria, and it starts off with the city of Ashur, which is like the ancient foundation of the Assyrian Empire, which again surprised me, because I always thought Nineveh was the origin of the Assyrian Empire, and Nineveh became the later capital of the Assyrian Empire, but actually the origin was from a city named Ashur. I learned a lot from this book, and I knew almost nothing about the Assyrian Empire before starting it, other than what you learn from the Bible. So almost all of this was new to me, and all of it was fascinating. Now the author points out one of the interesting ironies of history, as though we associate the Assyrian Empire with this autocratic, despotic regime. In the beginning, the evidence is that it was a rather democratic city-state, I guess like a lot of these smaller city-states were in the ancient world. But then as they became more and more powerful, they consolidated power into a king position. The Assyrian Empire initially spread over a fair amount of the Mesopotamian world, but then they actually, once they reached a powerful position, they retracted for a couple different reasons. One reason is the rise of the Hittite Empire, but then the other reason is the collapse of Bronze Age civilization, where, if you're not familiar, for some reason historians only partially understand. The Bronze Age empires just all collapsed. There was a big migration of peoples, some mysterious sea peoples who were attacking everybody, and disruption in the global trade network, and all these big empires collapsed, including the Assyrian one. But then after that, I guess that's the Assyrian Empire started to reform itself. And scholars, I guess, refer to this as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is a term I had heard before. Maybe you had heard it before as well. Always used to confuse me. I'm like, Okay, I know the Assyrian Empire from the Bible stories, but what is the Neo-Assyrian Empire? But yeah, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, I guess that's the empire we commonly think of as Assyria from the Bible stories. And that was reconquering the old territories. And the author uses the term Reconquista, comparing it to the Spanish Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. In the same way, the Assyrian kings were reconquering their old territory. And the author makes the case that they were consciously reconquering their old territory. So that they knew they had lost this territory. I guess the memory of that had been preserved. The Assyrian kings were adapting names for themselves which were reminiscent of the glorious past that Assyria had, and they were embarking on this Reconquista. I don't think the author actually originated the term Reconquista when referring to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. I think another author was the first one to make that comparison. But anyways, he uses it in this book, which may be as good as time as any to mention, that he makes frequent comparisons and analogies to other points in history, as well as the modern world. So it's one of the many ways in which he keeps this book fresh and interesting, is constantly comparing the Assyrian Empire, which is very old and strange and exotic, to more familiar areas of history to help make it seem a little bit more relatable to an audience. So yeah, that's another good point about this book. So yeah, there's the now one of the interesting things, I guess, is that until modern archaeology started in the 19th century, we really knew almost nothing about the old Assyrian Empire. So we knew what was in the Hebrew Bible, and we knew some of the writings from the ancient Greeks. But as he points out in this book, particularly at the end of this book, that was really more legend than fact. So at least for the Greeks. I'll get to the Bible in a minute. So yeah, from archaeology, we are able to uncover a lot of documents and chronicles and able to piece together the story of some of these old Assyrian kings. And the more detailed the record gets, the more narrative the history gets. And some of these kings we do know in some detail. And so he's actually able to do some storytelling here and tell the story of these kings as he gets to those parts in the book. Yes, and then this gets us to the Hebrew Bible. And a fair amount of this book is spent talking about the portrayal of the Assyrian Empire or the Assyrians in the Bible and comparing that to what the record shows. So, if you're at all interested in Bible studies, or the study of the historical Bible, this would be a good book to put on your list because it complements the history in the Hebrew Bible quite nicely. That being said, it is largely in line with books on the Bible I've already read. So, for example, reading the Old Testament, An Introduction by Lawrence Boat, a book I've previously reviewed on this channel, which talks about the historical accuracy of the Assyrian Empire as it's portrayed in the Bible, lines up very well with what's in this book. But yeah, it was interesting to read this book as well because now it's reinforced my idea or my conception of the historical accuracy of those Bible sections. And it's interesting. So we have some of the Hebrew kings attested to in the Assyrian record, like Ahab, Jehu. From the kingdom of Judah, we have Hezekiah. And then there's the famous passage in the Hebrew Bible when Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, comes in and invades Judah and lays siege to Jerusalem. And I guess before archaeology, all we had was the Hebrew Bible. But from archaeology, we now see the Assyrian records on this. And the Assyrian records actually line up pretty well with the story in the Bible. The difference is, in the Bible, there's this miracle about how the angel of death devastates the Assyrian army. That's not in the Assyrian record. That appears to be, those miracle stories, of course. If you're not a believer, you've got to take them skeptically. So that miracle story appears to be a fabrication. The Assyrian version of this was that it was Assyrian victory, having humbled the king Hezekiah and kept him trapped in Jerusalem like a caged bird. The Assyrian commander declared victory and left. So the Assyrians portrayed it as an Assyrian victory. The Bible portrays it as a victory for King Hezekiah, but both sources agree that the Assyrian army came up and laid siege to Jerusalem and then left. There's like a whole chapter on that incident in which he goes into a lot more detail and talks about the different theories about what might have happened and all the difference between the Assyrian record and the record in the Bible. So he goes into a fair amount of detail in here. And if you're, again, interested in the history behind the Bible, it's all fascinating. If you're at all a history nerd, all of it's fascinating. Sennacherib, as you may remember from the Bible, was killed by his two sons. This is something that the Hebrew Bible says, as his humiliating end. And sure enough, in here, it also talks about how Sennacherib was killed by his sons, and it talked about why they did it and the plot to overthrow him by his sons and the struggle for succession afterwards. That's all from unearthed documents. Something I forgot to mention earlier, but the reason we have so many documents about the Assyrian Empire is because the Assyrians wrote their documents in clay tablets, which then hardened, and then which were preserved. They were usually broken, but archaeologists can find the fragments, and they can often piece together the different fragments to make a text. And even when they can't, they still have a lot of fragments to work with. So they actually have a lot of stuff to work with when they're assembling the Assyrian history. And in later periods of history, writing would switch to leather and papyrus. And then those were not preserved. But the Assyrian records actually... We actually have a lot of them through archaeological findings. Of course, we don't have everything we could wish for, and there are frequent points in the history where the author says, okay, there's some gaps in our record here. We don't quite know what happened. But there's a lot. It's impressive how much of the story they've been able to reconstruct, given that, again, until the 19th century, we really knew nothing, almost nothing about the Assyrian record. So that's all interesting. Then he talks about the fall of the Assyrian Empire. The fall came quite suddenly, as contrasted with the Roman Empire, where there was a very slow decline. But Assyria had a number of enemies who were out to get him. Or her, I don't know, him, get her. The Babylonians and the Medes and the Egyptians and the kingdom of Judah also got dragged in to that war. You may remember that this is from the Bible again, but King Josiah, one of the good kings of Judah, was trying to fight Necho of Egypt, when Necho of Egypt was coming to the king of Assyria's aid. And that was the battle at Megiddo, in which King Josiah was killed, which is possibly where we get the idea of the Battle of Armageddon from. It's one of a few different contenders. Anyways, that's a digression. But that's something that's mentioned in here, not the Armageddon part, but the part about Josiah fighting Necho and how Egypt and Judah and Babylonia and the Medes all these different peoples, the Elamites were all involved in attacking Assyria. He calls it like the First World War. Not world in the global sense, but world in the sense of all the relevant civilizations in the Mediterranean got sucked into this conflict. Then the Assyrian Empire just got wiped out very quickly. And then, of course, if you know your Bible, it was the Babylonians after that, and then the Persians after that, and then etc. All of that's a very interesting story, well told in here. He also postulates a couple other theories about why the Assyrian Empire might have fallen. The idea of plague, the idea of climate change. And of course, when it comes to a plague or an epidemic, we've had that recently with the COVID. When it happens to climate change, that's the ongoing crisis that we're facing now. So there are parallels to nowadays. And again, he doesn't shy away from making those parallels. He also talks about inept rulers hastened the fall of Assyria, and he says, this is also something that we know something about today. He doesn't mention any names, but we know. So that's another way in which he makes this history relevant to modern people today. So he does a lot of that, where he kind of ties stuff in and makes it relevant to today's issues. Then he's got some interesting quotas to this. He's got a chapter called The Imperial Twilight, when it talks about some of the Assyrian civilizations which seem to have lingered on after the collapse of the empire. And that's interesting. That's something I never knew anything about. He's got a chapter, Assyria's Legacy on the Ground, when he talks about how Assyria... and in the next chapter, a model empire. How Assyria's idea of empire influenced the next civilizations. So he makes a point here that the Persian Empire, which came after the Babylonian Empire, was more influenced by the Assyrian model than they were on their immediate predecessors, the Babylonians. The Babylonian Empire, as an empire, looks like it had a very brief time in the sun before the Medes and the Persians overthrew it. And then the Medes and the Persians modeled their ideas on, were more attracted to the idea of the Assyrian Empire than the Babylonian Empire. So how those ideas and structures got passed on to the Persians, and then subsequently greater history. He's got a chapter called Distorted Reflections, in which he talks about the Assyrians as they're presented in the Hebrew Bible. And again, what seems to be accurate, what seems to be exaggerated, etc. Talks about the legend of Jonah and how that may have been influenced by an Assyrian legend. And then he talks about the Greeks. And the Greeks had these legends about Assyria, about a queen, what was her name? Semiramis, who was the wife of Ninur, who was the founder of Assyria. And again, not really, but according to the Greek legends. And then how these legends evolved over time through the Romans and through the Middle Ages. And, These were people's idea of what Assyria was before modern archaeology and the modern study of history, after which point they kind of fell out of favor, but how they influenced Western imagination for a couple thousand years before archaeology. So that was interesting. I didn't know anything about that. There's a depressing chapter called The Second Destruction, in which he talks about how a number of the Assyrian ruins have been destroyed by Islamic militants recently. When does this happen? Like 2019 or something? 2015. So, like within the last 10 years. What can you say? It's depressing to read about how these very old ruins that archaeologists had still hoped to study were destroyed by the Islamic militants and the ISIS for various reasons. And he talks about in this chapter what their reasons and rationale was for doing this, why they wanted to do it. It's an interesting chapter, how ancient Assyria is influencing world politics even today. Because it turns out some of the images of ancient Assyria had influenced Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which in turn had made the Islamic State against Assyria, etc. Again, interesting stuff in here. All in all, a very interesting book. I found parts of it more interesting than other parts. Again, my preference is for narrative history. So whenever we get to a section on kind of everyday life in the empire, I'm like, just get back to the narrative, please. And there are sections on everyday life in the empire. Let me see if I can find it here. Here we go. The chapter is chapter 13, and it's called Everyday Life in the Empire. But if you're like me and you want to get back to the narrative, it's just one chapter. Well, actually, it's not just that one chapter. There are a few other chapters where it talks about, the religions and the culture and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's mostly trying to make a narrative out of what we do know about Assyria, and then making educated guesses where there are gaps in the narrative. I would recommend this book to anyone who is interested in the subject. It's very readable. Now, this is the first book I've read on Assyria. Hopefully it won't be the last, but it's the first book, so I can't really compare it much to what else is out there. By all means, if anyone knows any other good books, good histories about Assyria, let me know in the comments down below. I am planning to check out more books. I like I said at the beginning of this video, I want to build up my knowledge of this ancient history. Would recommend it. So thank you very much, BookTube, and I will see you next time.